I want to ask you one thing, because I think that there is this idea going along that history should be written objectively.
And try to, yeah. You'll never be able to do that exactly, but try to at least.
But
strive for that.
I wanted to ask you, because this has always struck me as weird, that, as you mentioned, the Marxist perspective of historiography, it is somehow based on the idea that we cannot be objective, but somehow we are to think that Marxist history is objective.
Yeah.
So I cannot understand this, because I don't know if this follows from the tenets of dialectical materialism, that I think we should say that they come forward with Engels. Marx didn't write about them, but there is this idea that going along that our thoughts are determined by our position in society and our position with respect to the means of production and to the relations of production in the Marxist paradigm. Yeah. So I don't see why, on the one hand, they are attacking history as historiography as non-objective, but on the other hand, they think that they're supposed to be thinking that theirs is objective, or they present it as objective. Isn't that a bit weird?
They're just hypocrites. Yeah. It's just a double standard, as simple as that. Yeah, one rule for them and one rule for everyone else.
So do you think that there are ways of mitigating the idea of non-objective history? So what should the historian do? Should we write, for instance, that we have a biases, and reader, be mindful of the fact that we have those biases?
Probably about the best you can hope for. It is impossible to be truly objective. It's impossible to really do that. It's impossible to know the past with complete certitude. You can barely say what's happening in the present with objectivity, right? So in a past the past is profoundly lost to us. You can never go back, you can never see it again. So it will always be, on some level, a narrative. All history will be a narrative of some level, and it won't be objective. So the best you can hope for is to inform your audience of that, and keep that in mind while you read my version of history.
And I think that we should be mindful of the fact that novels or books in the contemporary sense were a sort of Renaissance invention. People for instance, in antiquity, they had no books in the way we have them today. They had long scrolls, and they were handwriting them. And the more they were... we had monks, for instance, who were reading those scrolls, and they were copying by hand. And as language was changing, they also started, there were lots of issues in translation. So this is a really interesting stuff about how we can read about the past.
Yeah, and even before that, you've got the oral tradition. I mentioned Homer already, but something like the Iliad or the Odyssey is before it was passed down just through word of mouth and remembering it before it was ever written down for a long time. But yeah, the idea of the novel, you mentioned the novel there. I've read a little bit of sort of literary analysis about what was the first novel. Yeah. And what most people say, it was sort of in the 18th century, 19th century. But some even say, in a sense, the Odyssey is the first novel. Yeah. Of course, not in our modern sense of what a novel is, but in a way, you could argue. So, yeah, there's no nice, clean answer to that. But, yeah.
So I wonder whether the idea of sustaining a national identity is not just put forward by books, or whether it's there is a notion of national identity, or the identity of a people across time, that is somehow sustained by people and their customs and their memories, their identification with particular groups, their commemoration of past tragedies and triumphs. What would you say about that?
Yeah, all those things. Yeah, a matrix of 1,001 different things that go into making in each individual person's mind their concept of their country and their relationship to it. I think just to sort of cut to the quick on what we're getting at here is that there's been lots of, in our modern times, there's lots and lots of opposition and criticism to patriotism.
Yes.
And nationalism and the very idea of nations, and that there's something, or not even in our modern times. I mean, it goes back centuries that there's something wrong-headed and weird about being a patriot. Well, I just reject nearly all of that. I'm not going to inch the Overton window back. I'm just going to pick the whole Overton window up and move it entirely, and just say no. That nearly all of that comes from like anarchists, leftists, socialists, people that want to destroy nation states for their own reasons. So they'll just deride it all. They'll say, "What's a classic line? It's actually sometimes I think taken out of context, but that patriotism is the last resort of the scoundrel, or something like that."
I think so.
Yeah, I think it was Samuel Adams, and it's taken out of context, but nonetheless, it stands alone as a statement. I just reject all of that. That's people that want to undermine and destroy nations for other nefarious reasons.
I think you raise a really important point, and I think we should be a bit historical in how we approach it and see how we got into today's mess in a way.
Yeah.
So I think that in a way, the concepts we use nowadays to describe our political reality are very much influenced by Cold War ideology, or by the way that the Cold War was portrayed ideologically. So, for instance, we use words like left and right, and many people nowadays think that these are not the optimal words in which we should describe our current political struggles. So, I think that throughout history, maybe that's a generalization, but I think it's a conjecture that is worth putting forward. And tell me if you think that it is wrong. I'm really open to being convinced otherwise. But I think that in most cases, the public is thinking in terms of really simplistic dilemmas, in terms of A or B. And I think that this is problematic because it's always more complex than that.
Yeah.
It is really easy to address the whole public because not everyone is as educated as the other person in the public, but it is really easy to put forward a simplistic dilemma to address the lowest common denominator. So I think that through the Cold War, we were presented with the dilemma of individualism on the one hand, or extreme individualism, that it knows no group or recognizes no belonging into a group. And on the other hand, collectivism that was associated with the Soviet Union. And I think that this way of putting forward this simplistic dilemma led many people to think that in let's say, the Western world, in Western countries, led many people to think that somehow any form of group or a group identity is bad and inherently a threat to individual people. And I think that was also magnified by the fact that those who were in the USSR camp, both based in the USSR and outside it, like I think Sartre, for instance, they did present every form of group that is not the class or the proletariat or the students later in the 60s as a form of fascism. So I think that it is very important to dissociate this and show and reassert the idea that there can be groups that they are on the one hand important for individuals to belong to, but they are not fascist. Or I think we should stop. We should stop thinking in terms of the old left, in terms that the old Cold War, USSR backed left wants its opponents to think. What do you think about this?
Yeah, you've touched on a number of interesting things there. Yeah, I think just one of the last things you said, just to say that lots of people on the left, Guardianistas, people like that, want to equate any populism, any hint of populism or nationalism with being a Nazi.
Yes.
If you even like the tiniest hint of civic nationalism, or if you hear a populist dog whistle and you don't immediately take up an Antifa flag, then you are Goebbels, you are Hitler.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just absolute crazy nonsense. just because just because Mussolini and Hitler were nationalists, it doesn't mean that every aspect of all nationalism is complete barbarous, monstrous insanity.
Yeah.
Not at all. But that's what they want you to think, of course. That's what they want. But the Cold War thing is really interesting, and the outmoded paradigm of the left and the right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But it's easy for people, it's shorthand, isn't it? It's easy for people still to use it. But I think you're absolutely right that it's a bit outmoded. I mean, I would say, although it's still very simplistic, what I'm about to say, is that it's less a matter, in my mind, people may well disagree with what I'm about to say heavily, but I hope not. But it might be less a case of left and right and globalists and non-globalists.
Yeah.
It's more that people that want a globalized world and no borders and no nations, and people that don't want that.
Yeah.
It's not left and right. It's more globalists and non-globalists. That seems to make a bit more sense. It's still very, very simple, still very, very simplified. But because left and right really, there's this old paradigm of left and right. There's lots of economics that are bound up in that. I read an interesting book where it was talking about how Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine in the late 18th century set the tone for what became left and right. And it's not just politics, there's lots of economics. There's a few different layers of ideology. Whereas now in the paradigm I just mentioned of globalists and non-globalists, it's less about economy really, and it's more about demographic change. It's more about all sorts of other ideologies.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.